I'm reading Penguin Classics, Don Quixote by Cervantes. It is translated by J.M.Cohen, and he writes, one of the best adventure stories in the world. Now, he talks about Don Quixote, it's written. By far the most famous book in Spanish literature, was originally intended by Cervantes as a skit on traditional popular ballads, but he also parodied the romances of chivalry. As a result, he produced one of the most entertaining adventure stories of all times and created in Don Quixote and his faithful squire Sancho Panza two of the greatest characters in fiction. By 1615, when he died, old, a soldier, a gentleman, and poor, his book was already famous in both French and English. J.M.Cohen's translation presents a great work in lively, vigorous, and modern English. And talking about translations, even though translations are not able to really give the joy of the original text, syntax, ideas, or idioms, but it is enough to impact one's life and enjoy the cadence of the time. And it's really nice that J.M. Cohen has been able to give us the pleasure of that, those times, and the way he has put forth the story is delightful, and it is really interesting. Now, this is an epic novel, and originally it was published in two parts, 1605 and 1615. Now, the basic story is Don Quixote, or the ingenious gentleman Don Quixote of La Mancha, is about a man with a questionable sanity who goes on a series of quests to become a knight, accompanied by his squire Sancho. It is famous. The novel is considered by literary historians to be one of the most important books of all time. It is often cited as the first modern novels. The word Quixote, used to mean the impractical pursuit of idealistic goal, entered common usage. And the main message that you get is one must live life in a genuine way, passionately, in spite of what other people think. Now, Don Quixote is obsessed with chivalry. He lives a frugal life as an avid reader of chivalric romances. He's full of fantasies about chivalry. Eventually, he goes mad and decides to become a knight errant. Lesson behind Don Quixote, yes, is that there is a value in all people, regardless of social standing, worldview, weight, age, etc. Don, who aspired to be a chivalrous knight, shows how ridiculous antiquated beliefs can be of those who have conquered living in the present, says Sancho Panza. Don Quixote is a hero of romance, chivalrous but impractical, fictitious character. He is an imaginary person. There was sort of a mental illness one can find when one's reading, perhaps paranoia, and he's like a paranoid or paranoia, persistent delusions disorder, a healthy reaction to a mad world. And he went crazy. He is mad. His brain's like dried up due to his reading, and he's unable to separate reading from fiction, a trait that was appreciated at the time as funny. Cervantes was also using Don Quixote's insanity to prove the eternal debate between free will and fate. Talking about his a famous quote from Don Quixote is that for neither good nor evil can last forever, and so it follows that as evil has lasted a long time, good must now be close at hand. And another quote by Don Quixote is, I have never died all my life. And one more, Virtue is persecuted by the wicked more than it is loved by the good. And his lady love was he felt, according to Don, a knight errant also needs a lady to love, and he selects a peasant girl from a nearby town, christening her Dulcinea di Toboso. That's also very funny. His name actually was Alonso Quixano, and he invents a name after falling into insanity as Don Quixote. The novel is considered a masterpiece as it is variously interpreted as a parody of chivalric romances, an epic of heroic idealism, a commentary on the author's alienation, and a critique of Spanish imperialism. Don Quixote is a metaphor for what we are experiencing in education in the current historical movement. There is epistemic confusion, then simulated competence, and automated extravagance. Don Quixote slang, what does it mean? It is a person who is both idealistic and impractical, is often said to be Quixotic. Don Quixote was addicted to reading stories of chivalry, as I pointed out before. And he was so engrossed that he would hardly sleep. And by not sleeping adequately because he was reading, he is easily given to anger. He believes every word of his fictional books to be true. For him, life is in a realm of fantasy. And interestingly, his diet consisted of more beef than mutton, and with minced meat on most nights, lentils on Fridays, eggs and bacon on Saturdays, and a pigeon extraordinary on Sundays. He consumed 3/4 of his revenue on all of this. Now, idiom of Don Quixote, it means that when you say you're like Don Quixote, all about being out of touch with reality, an impractical person who has illusions about his own heroism. Well, when he was at the windmills charging them, that means that he's so eager to be a courageous fighter for the good that he makes up situations that have no basis in real life. His horse is Roti Nante. Not only his horse, but also his double. He's not only his horse, but he's also his double, it seems. Like him, he's awkward, past his prime, and engaged in a task beyond his capacity. So, of course, it is the first modern novel. And talking about his horse, we find that his horse accompanies him on his adventures that he dedicates to his sweetheart, Dulcinea di Toboso. And his appearances, like Don Quixote has a pale skin, skinny body, pointy nose, and a beard and a mustache. So if you take talking about the moral of the lesson, it teaches us that life is to be challenged, that passion and discipline of the determined soul are a foundational element of being a leader. He does not accept the current reality. He forces his creative imagery, his commitment, and his happiness on it. So that could be the moral, or if you can, for you, I mean, you could differ from what's written. And of course, if someone calls you Quixote as a noun, it means that an impractical idealist. So I'll read from Cohen's introduction, calls it the translator's introduction, and he says that some excuse seems necessary for reintroducing in a fresh translation a book which has been one of the world's best sellers for 3 centuries and which already exists in 7 or 8 English versions. But for all that, the modern reader would be hard put to it to choose a good Don Quixote. The best and the raciest version, Shelton's, being almost contemporary with the original, is the nearest to Cervantes in spirit. It suffers, however, like other 17th century work, for a lack of familiarity with the idiom, etc. And that's why he thought of rewriting. And he says that, like, he says Quixote enjoys a peculiar place among the world's book as the only well-known representative of a considerable literature for far from the 14th to the 17th centuries. The Spanish was among the great literature of the world, etc. he writes. And he also writes that, but if Don Quixote increasingly gains our sympathy as the book progresses and the sadistic slapstick of the first chapters give way to the inventive richness of the knight's disquisitions on chivalry, his conversation with the squire, and his magnificently staged penance, Sancho wins our affection by leaps and bounds. A genius seems to develop in the man whose first preoccupations were his belly and his comfort. We watch the coward of the adventure of the fulling mills pull off his first exercise in fiction and the report of his interview with Dulcinea. We see him go from strength to strength and note the ebb and flow of his credulity until we have to applaud his consummate skill in passing a peasant girl off on his master as Dulcinea herself under enchantment. From there to his successful spell as governor of his isle, as we see his wonder and amazement at his own ingenuity. But we are hardly distressed at his return to the humdrum life of his village, for however much his master's insanity may have drawn him after it into exalted sphere of action, his credulity was never complete and his feet were in reality always well planted on the ground. So once again, I'm just going to read, and finally, a word on the translation itself. I have taken as few liberties with the text as possible and tried to adhere to a modern vocabulary and modern word order, except in those passages where the original language is deliberately archaic. I've had to translate most of Sancho's proverbs, though occasionally I found an English saying sufficiently close to be able to substitute it. My chief difficulties have been in the pastoral narratives, where the language of the original is frequently stilted, and no amount of adaptation can make the story flow very freely. Some of the oaths and expletives have had to be toned down, as in this respect the richness of our vocabulary has been considerably depleted since the 17th century, and such a literal rendering as "by God's hand" or "woe is me" is now merely funny. We have no doubt lost something by reducing our stock of epithets, but the translator must make do with what remains. As to the interpolated poems, I cannot pretend to be happy. 1 or 2 of the sonnets have distinction, but most of the pieces are not very good. But since they are put into the mouths of various characters, we must think of them as incidental only to the story and not as a serious endeavor at poetry writing by Cervantes. I have generally taken versions from the older translators, but often adapting them, particularly when they are Shelton's for I do not feel any confidence that my own attempts would be better. But the prefatory verses I have left out and generally produce my own renderings of the ballads, as I feel that the versions in full rhymes usually quoted make them appear more akin to the he's talked about various things. The Inchcape Rock he talks about, than to the King's Estmere or Chevy Chase with which they belong. I have put hardly any notes at the bottom of the page, for I felt that the obscurities are few and no attempts to explain them do much more than pile up indigestible historical references that prevent the reader from getting along with the book, which is one of the best adventure stories in the world and contains two of the greatest characters in all fiction, writes the translator Cohen. So just to give you a taste of it, let's go to the chapter 1 and just read a few lines, which treats of the quality and way of life of the famous knight Don Quixote de la Mancha. In a certain village in La Mancha, which I do not wish to name, there lived not long ago a gentleman, one of those who have always a lance in the rack, an ancient shield, a lean hack, and a greyhound for coursing. His habitual diet consisted of stew, more beef than mutton, of hash, most nights boiled bones on Sundays, lentils on Fridays, and a young pigeon as a Sunday treat, and on this he spent 3/4 of his income. The rest of it was on a fine cloth doublet, velvet breeches and slippers for holidays, and a homespun suit of the best in which he decked himself on weekdays. His household consisted of a housekeeper of rather more than 40, a niece not yet 20, and a lad for the field and market, who saddled his horse and wielded the pruning hook. Our gentleman was verging on 50, of tough constitution, lean-bodied, thin-faced, a great early riser, and a lover of hunting. They say that his surname was Quixanda or Quixda, but there is some difference of opinion among authors on this point. However, by very reasonable conjecture, we may take it that he was called Quixana, but this does not much concern our story, enough that we do not depart by so much as an inch from the truth in telling of it. The reader must know then that this gentleman, in the times when he had nothing to do, as was the case for most of the year, gave himself up to the reading of books of knight errantry, which he loved and enjoyed so much that he almost entirely forgot his hunting and even the care of his estate. So odd and foolish, indeed, did he go on this subject, that he sold many acres of corn land to buy these books of chivalry to read, and in this way brought home every one he could get, and of them all he considered none so good as the works of the famous Feliciano de Silva, for his brilliant style and those complicated sentences seemed to him very pearls, especially when he came upon those love passages and challenges frequently written in the manner of the reason for the unreason, with which you treat my reason, so weakens my reason, that with reason I complain of your beauty. And also when he read the high heavens with their stars divinely fortify you in your divinity and make you deserving of the desert that your greatness deserves, etc. See how interesting it is. So I'm going to read a little from chapter 31 of the delectable conversations which passed between Don Quixote and Sancho Panza, his squire, and other incidents. So I'm reading from page 269. You spoke wrong in saying that I was cursing my fate, said Don Quixote. On the contrary, I bless it and shall bless it all the days of my life for making me worthy of loving so high a lady as Dulcinea del Toboso. So high, answered Sancho, that I swear she's a good handbreadth taller than I am. How do you know that, Sancho? Asked Don Quixote. Did you measure yourself against her? I did, replied Sancho. Like this, I went to help her load a sack of corn onto an ass and so got so very close together. That's how I noticed she was a good hand's breadth taller than I am. But is it not true, replied Don Quixote, that her great height is accompanied and adorned by 1,000,000,000 intellectual graces? One thing you cannot deny me, Sancho. When you stood close to her, did you not smell a spicy odor and aromatic fragrance, something unutterably sweet, so which I cannot give a name? I mean an essence or aroma, as if you were in some rare glover's shop? All that I can say, answered Sancho, is that I got a sniff of something rather mannish. It must have been because she was running with sweat from the hard work. He says, it would not be that, replied Don Quixote. You must have had a cold or have smelt yourself. For well, I know the scent of that rose among thorns, that lily of the field, that liquid ambergris. It's quite possible, replied Sancho, but very often there's that same smell about me that seemed to be coming from the lady's Dulcinea. But it's not surprising, for one devil is like another. So, you can, so funny the way it's written. Well, that's the ISBN. Well, indeed an interesting read. And the translation is good, undoubtedly.